cooking with Julia Childs. Just kidding. Okay, clearly not Julia Childs, but you asked for the sourdough video. So this is the video that I'm making. I'm basing this sourdough loaf on the natural leavened bread recipe that's on King Author's website. So kingauthor.com's natural leavened sourdough bread recipe. So that's what we're going to be making today. So I've already got here my sourdough starter, which I fed this morning. I waited for it to about double in size. What I usually do is I put a piece of tape on my container where it is, and then once it's doubled, then I know that it's ready to go. After I fed it, I put it in the oven with the oven light on because that gets to about 90 degrees. Took it a few hours for it to double, and now we're ready to go. So in addition to my sourdough starter that I'm getting ready to measure out, I've modified the recipe a little bit. So online, the recipe says to use 5 cups of unbleached all-purpose flour, but I like to bake with bread flour, and I've actually only used 4 cups of bread flour. So I have here 4 cups of bread flour. And where it said to use 3/4 cup of whole wheat flour, I have used 1 3/4 cup of whole wheat flour. So I took 1 cup of flour from the bread flour and turned it into whole wheat flour because we like our bread a little bit wheatier. And then this is something that's not on the recipe, but a friend of mine told me that putting potato flakes in bread kind of makes the bread a little bit softer. My youngest one doesn't really like the super huge crunch of sourdough. It's a pity. But anyways, I always put some potato flakes in every loaf of bread that I make. It does make it a little bit softer. Another trick to softer bread is to use milk instead of water, but I'm not doing that with my sourdough because I let my sourdough sit for hours and I don't want milk sitting for hours. So anyway, here I have 1/2 cup or 1 ounce of mashed potato flakes. It's literally like the only thing we use our mashed potato flakes in the house for, but it's a nice little addition. All right, the recipe also calls for 1 3/4 cup of room temperature water. Make sure your water is not too hot. You don't want it to be hot because it will kill the yeast inside of the sourdough starter. And I have here my 1 3/4 cup. You may notice that my water looks a little bit yellow. And the reason for that is because I'm not using water. I am using my whey that was strained from the yogurt that I made. So whenever I make yogurt, when I have whey left over, one of the things that I've been doing with the whey is putting it into our baking because it is a good source of some minerals and stuff that were strained from the yogurt. So, and it doesn't really affect the taste. Actually, it gives it kind of a nice taste because it has a little bit of a sweetness to it. All right, and then I've got salt that I'm gonna be using later, but not when we first start mixing. And since I'm making this video today, I decided not to use my bread maker. I'm gonna be putting it in the KitchenAid, but of course you can also mix by hand. All right, so the first thing I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be measuring out my 2 cups of ripe sourdough starter. So let me go ahead and get that going. And that was why we needed to feed it this morning. Some people say that you should actually feed it and then wait and then feed it again and then it's ready for baking. But I found that if I take it out the fridge and feed it in the morning, usually by the afternoon, it's pretty much good to go for baking. Okay, so here I have my 2 cups of sourdough starter, and I'm actually gonna go ahead and put that right into the bowl, the mixing bowl here. My starter is actually a little bit runnier than it normally is. I usually use a pretty stiff starter, but this morning I wasn't really measuring out the ingredients when I was feeding it, and so it wasn't really as stiff as it normally was, and then I just didn't care enough to fix it. If your sourdough starter is a little bit stiffer, you'll just probably need more water, and as it is the case with mine today, because it's so runny, I may actually need less water than the recipe calls for. So I've got the dough hook on my KitchenAid here, but again, if you're just mixing by hand, then you know, whatever you're using to mix by hand. And if you're using this recipe in the bread machine, which I often do, what I actually do is I just use the regular bake setting, so the one to make regular bread, but I stop it before it bakes. Because I take it out and form it and stuff, but I like the regular bake setting because it mixes and then it rests for 25 minutes and then it mixes again, and that's actually what we're going to be doing today because we're not going to add the salt until after the first time it's rested. That way the sourdough really has some time to do some work in building up and stuff before we start to delay its activity with the salt. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in my flour. Sourdough is super, super basic. There's only just these few ingredients, so not much to say about that. So we're gonna take a few minutes and just get this dough really mixed up. What we're looking for is dough that pulls away from the side of the bowl and starts to stick together to form one thing. So we're gonna let that, what I like to do is I let it mix for about 5 minutes or so. And then once I kind of see what the consistency is like, if I need to add some more flour, then I add more flour or more water at that time. So you can see here when you're looking at the dough mixing that it's pulling away from the sides. My dough is still making this sound that sounds a little bit like moisture sticking, so that means that my dough is actually a little bit too wet, and I can see that because I can see that there's still some dough remnants there. So I'm going to add a little bit more flour here to kind of dry that up a little bit. And it doesn't take much, so just be careful if you're adding flour that you're not overdoing it. So I usually start with, like, I use my tiniest measuring spoon that I have, and I kind of just start adding it in there a little bit. So you can see I actually only added about maybe a tablespoon of flour, and even just that tablespoon of flour was enough to get it to the right consistency where now it's pulling away from the sides of the bowl. You don't see the little dots of dough anymore, and it's not making that sticky sound. So now we've got our nice good looking dough. I'm going to let this mix for about maybe 3 to 5 more minutes, and then after that I am going to put I'm going to take it off. I'm going to put the cover on it here, and I'm actually going to just let it sit. It's about 70 degrees or so in the room that I'm currently in, so I don't really need it to rise during this 20-minute time period. So I'm just going to go ahead and let it sit right here during this time period, and then after it's over, we are going to come back at that time and add the salt to it. So it still doesn't have the salt in it, so don't forget, we're still missing one more ingredient. We're going to come back to add that. We're giving this about 20 minutes or so. So I will see you back in 20 minutes so we can add our next ingredient. Hey Siri, set a timer for 20 minutes. It's been about 20 minutes, actually a little bit longer. And so now we're ready to add our salt. So I'm going to go ahead and uncover my dough here. And you may have noticed that my dough's actually already started to rise a little bit. Now this process that we spent, the 20 minutes, that's the Autolyse process. That's to help develop good gluten bonds, according to the King Author website. But now we are ready to go ahead and add our salt. So I have here my pre-measured 2½ teaspoons of salt. I'm going to go ahead and add that in. And I'm going to actually let this mix for about 5 to 7 minutes. On the bread machine, it mixes for, I think, about 10 minutes. But if you're mixing by hand, you just want to make sure that you get a really good mix. Make sure that you're getting the salt in. And then once it's finished mixing, I'm going to put the lid back on it again. I'm going to cover it up. And this time I'm actually going to put it back into my oven. Again, my oven is not on. It just has the oven light on. It puts the temperature at about 90 degrees. So I'm going to mix the salt in, put it in the oven. I'm going to mix the salt in, put the cover on it, and I'm going to stick it in the oven for about an hour. And then we're going to come back and we're going to knead it one more time. I just took my dough out of the oven where it's been rising for the past hour. And this is actually where I'm going to start taking some creative liberties with the recipe, if you will. So what the recipe says you're supposed to do now is that you're supposed to lay it out on a floured surface, and you're going to fold it like a business letter, and then you're going to let it rest again and rise for another hour. And then you're going to come back and shape it, and then you're going to let it rise again. So that's a lot of steps there, and for the most part I tend to just skip those steps, mostly because a lot of time I actually make my dough before I go to bed, and then I break it when I wake up in the morning, or I just make my dough and then I just let it rise during the day, and then I bake it at night. So I don't really mess with it too much. I find that even if I don't do all those extra steps in between, the bread still turns out fine. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to be putting it out on a floured surface here, and I'm going to go ahead and knead it a little bit, but then I'm going to actually go ahead and shape it and put it in the bowls and cover it and just let it continue the rising process. And when it's just done that one rise, I'm going to go ahead and bake it after that. So I've got here my one thing that you can have if you're baking is, I don't know if it's pronounced a couche or a couche cloth, but this is what I typically use. It's a linen cloth that I typically put my bread dough on. I'll put it out on this, and then I'll cover it up with it and I let it sit. I am going to use that for one of my bowls, but in case you don't have one of these, another thing that you can use is you can just use any kitchen towel that you have. So I have a couple of kitchen towels. They're clean, obviously, and my hands are clean because I'm going to knead the dough, but I'm going to use the kitchen towels. I'm going to flour these and put them in the dough, and in the bowl, and I'm gonna let the dough rise in these kitchen towels instead. Well, one of them is, one's gonna use the cloth because I have it. So the recipe calls for you to divide the dough in half, and it makes two loaves of bread, which you can do. I typically actually use my Dutch oven, so I just use one loaf of bread, but today I'm going to follow it according to the recipe. So I've got two bowls here. I don't have two of the exact same bowls, but these are pretty close in shape. Just one stainless steel, not silver, and one is just glass. But these are the bowls I'm going to use. If you have a basket, the Benetton baskets that are for proofing doughs, and of course that is what you would use. But I don't actually have any of those baskets because I don't normally proof my dough in a basket. I normally just let my dough rise in the Dutch oven that I'm baking it in, and then I just put it straight in the oven from there. I'm going to go ahead and flour my surface a little bit here before I pour my dough out. All right, so I went ahead and just kind of kneaded it just like the directions said, which is to roll it like to fold it up like a business letter. So you fold up one side and then the other, and then I squish it down, and I do that a couple of times. And I don't actually have whatever the tool is that they tell you to use, a scraper. I don't have a dough scraper, obviously, because you saw me pulling the dough out with my hands. And I guess I could invest in one, but it just hasn't seemed worthwhile. And so I don't have a dough scraper to cut my dough with either. So I'm actually just using this nylon knife that I happen to have. You can just find something that works for you if you are like me and you don't have a dough scraper either. All right, so now as you can see, I've got 2 halves of sourdough, and what I'm going to do is take my kitchen towel, and you want to make sure that you line this with flour really, really good, because you want for the dough to easily come off of the towel later when we flip it over so that we can put it on the stoneware to bake. I'm actually gonna... And so I've just lined my bowl with a flour towel. And now I'm actually going to start shaping my bread dough now. So what you want to do is you want to shape it into a circle, but you want to tuck the ends super tight. So I mean a ball, I guess. But what you want to do is make sure that you're tucking it while you're shaping it. And the tighter you can tuck it, the better, because it is going to kind of come loose as it's rising. So I try to get as nice of a tight tuck on it as I can, so you can see I'm kind of like, as I'm shaping it, I'm smoothing it down on the sides. And then once you've got that nice little ball shape and all the seams are on the bottom, because that's where we've tucked it all in, what you're actually going to do is you're going to, I'm gonna roll this in a little bit of flour here on my cloth because it's a little bit sticky. So once I've got my nice tucked ball, I'm going to actually put it seam side up. Seam side up. So this is actually going to be the bottom of the loaf, but we're going to raise it in the bowl, and then later on we're going to flip it out, and this is going to be the top. So you want to make sure that you put your dough in seam side up. I'm going to lay that right there in my bowl. Go ahead and do my second one as well. All right, I've got another nice tight ball here. And so what I'm going to do with this one is I'm actually going to go ahead and use my cloth here and put my cloth straight into the bowl. So I'm just going to, and it already has flour on it from where I just used it. So I'm just going to put it right on here. Drop this guy right into the bowl here. So now I've got my 2 loaves. They're each in their respective bowls. I'm going to make sure that I cover them up so that they don't dry out. And then I'm going to stick them back into my unheated oven just with the oven light on, and I'm going to let these rise. Now there's a few ways that you can let it rise. I'm actually putting mine in my oven because I want to bake tonight, so I don't want it to take 6 or 8 or 10 hours. I've actually in the past put my dough in the fridge and let it rise overnight up to 12 hours or 14 hours. If it's during the winter time, I typically make my dough late at night, like 10 o'clock at night, and then I will let it rise, and then I'll wake up the next morning and bake it so that we can have fresh bread for breakfast. So you can play around with that and see. A lot of it is going to depend on the temperature in your room and also how sour you like your sourdough. So some ways that you can make your sourdough more sour are to let it rise a little bit longer, and also to use things like rye inside of the bread. The sourdough starter, that will actually help with a more sour bread as well. So I've got these now, they're ready to go. I'm going to go and put these in my oven, which is going to decrease my rising time, and then we'll come and check on them in a little bit and we will see if they are ready to go into the oven. Welcome back. It's been about 2.5 hours since I first put the bread dough in the oven. Like I said, this isn't my normal process. I don't normally let it rise this fast, but since I had it in the oven with the light on at 90 degrees, it took a little less time to rise. About 30 minutes ago, I took both of the bowls out of the oven so that I could begin preheating the oven for cooking. So right now, the oven is preheated to 450 degrees. Inside of the oven, I have my stoneware that I'm going to bake on, as well as a cast iron pan that I'm going to be putting hot water in. So the dough here we can see has risen to about twice its size. The test that I like to use to determine whether or not the dough is ready to bake is I like to use what's called the poke test. So I like to basically poke the dough and just to see if it has a fingerprint that remains afterwards. And if it's got a little divot like this that doesn't come back, then that tells me that the dough is ready to be baked. If I poke the dough and it immediately pops back up with no divot, then I know that it needs a little bit longer. So this one here, I'm poking as well, and you can see that it's kind of keeping its little divot right there. So I've got here my parchment paper. My parchment paper is actually going to go into the oven with the bread. I'm putting it on this pan right now so that I can just slide the parchment paper onto the pan. If you aren't going to do it this way, another option that the instructions give you is that you can, if you're not using a stone, turn them onto a parchment lined baking sheet, which would be this one, slash them, and then place the baking sheet in the oven. So if you don't have a baking stone that you're baking on, you can just use a baking sheet, put parchment paper on it, and then bake it that way. But I'm actually going to bake mine on the stone that I already have in the oven, so I'm just kind of using this baking sheet upside down as a method of transportation for them. After I get them onto the parchment paper, I'm going to move them into the oven and slide them right onto my baking stone. And at the same time, I'm also going to pour boiling water into the cast iron pan that is already in the oven. Both of those are already hot, so they're just waiting. Now this is, I believe it's called a baker's lom. It's just to cut the bread. If you don't have one of these, you can just use a sharp knife and that'll work as well. Or even a razor blade, that will work actually even better. Okay, these are both ready to go into the oven now, along with the hot water, and we're going to let that bake for about 35 to 40 minutes, and we'll see how they look when they come out. And now we have the bread that just came out of the oven. It baked for about 35 minutes. It's a little bit more brown than I typically make it. I don't like my bread usually quite so dark, but this is the color of a lot of sourdough loaves that I see. So we're just gonna let this cool, and then we'll be able to have some delicious sourdough.